Yeah, so if I could get Elizabeth also to join, let's go up out on the stage and,
I've got a hand mic, so if you raise your hand, I'll come to you. Questions? Question.
This is a question for Elizabeth. There's a lot of talk, or there has been a lot of talk over time about various technologies allowing buildings to be built taller. And, you know, for example, as you know, the elevator and structural steel, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm sort of wondering if the vibration mitigation technology has allowed for taller buildings, and when it, from a commercial perspective, was really effectively implemented, because I do remember being in the World Trade Center towers on the 106th floor and literally getting sick every time it rained. So I'm just wondering when it was really commercially viable.
Yes, so if you look at just the strength of concrete, we could build buildings, but they'd be really wide. We could build buildings a mile tall, twice as tall as the tallest building right now. The limiting factor on it is actually the elevators, and to some degree, how big a building somebody wants to have in their neighborhood. But the needle buildings that are coming up, like the really skinny buildings that you see even coming up around New York, those buildings are made possible by vibration mitigation. So a lot of them have not just one damper in them at the top of the building, but also in the middle. When steel was first started to be used for taller buildings, so buildings got taller and steel was used to build them. There's a set of 1970s buildings, and they're still around. And if you're in one of them on a windy day, you'll hear them creak. And if you're in them on a really windy day, then you'll have to wait to use the elevator. So vibration is the thing that becomes the limiting design criteria for very narrow buildings. But the technology exists to build taller. It's just whether or not you want to wait that long to get to the top, right?
Next question.
Thank you. I have a question for the third speaker. I'm a journalist from Turkey, and I did a story about 2 years ago from NASA. It was about Parkinson's disease, sending some experimental equipment to find some sort of cure for the disease. And I was just wondering if you have anything to say on that. And it was related to the gravity, and it could, well, the article, as far as I remember, it was about 2 years ago, and maybe like having no gravity would make it easier to work on the disease in space. If you could talk about it, or if you're aware of it. Thank you.
So I'm not terribly familiar with the mechanisms of how Parkinson's works and the details of it. I mean, I wish I could say more about it. I know that it is a drug, or it's a disease that is a potential application for the capsule technology. However, I'm not terribly familiar with like if you go into a microgravity environment or just the differences of how it would operate. But I know there are a number of biotech people here in the audience who might have some more thoughts on it as well. There's Joe, there's Ben, so they might be able to give you some more perspective on what's happening with that. I'm sorry.
Another question back here, way in the back.
I have a question for Miss Elizabeth. In relation to the tune mass damper, properties of the building is normally changed throughout the years, and the design of a tune mass damper is really influenced by these properties, and they need to be tuned exactly with the dynamic reactions and behavior of a building. In the years, how do you tune your pipes with the water inside based on the mechanical properties of the building?
That's a perfect question. So I can't see you, but I owe you your $20 later. So for a conventional damper, it's really hard to change the tuning. Like if you have a concrete vat, you would have to change the dimensions of the vat, or if you have a pendulum, you would have to change the length of the pendulum. The tuning comes in the air spring side, not the water side. So you can make very significant difference.
as where you guys were in starting your companies in, I guess, partnership with NASA? Or was there an availability for you to know as far as what technologies were already being taken advantage of, as far as what other companies were out there, or if there was any like lists or like general idea for that?
Sure. So it depends on the type of technology you're working with. One resource you can look at, there's a resource called the Federal Register, where it's the publication of the federal government of pretty much any kind of action it's looking, or any kind of rule or policy it's looking to implement. Anytime there is a exclusive or partially exclusive license given, they will have to report in there that they're planning to give this license. So you can go through and take a look and see what sort of licenses NASA has been giving out lately, or have given out in the recent past, at least in terms of ones with exclusive rights that would forbid you from being able to go in and do it. Other than that, you can also get in touch with NASA and ask them and see what has been taken or what's out there. If something is listed in the catalog currently, I would be very surprised if it was there and then also not available in some regards. So that's also probably a pretty good way of being able to check it. But I imagine Stephen has a better idea than I do of how NASA policy works on that matter.
No, it's true. Once a technology has been either exclusively licensed or we'll pull it off so that it doesn't compete with that other company. But you can, a lot of times we'll have technologies that are licensed for certain markets. And so if you go in and you ask for the technology you want to license, if someone else already has it for the medical industry, but you want to take it over to manufacturing or into energy, then there's a potential for being able to do another license on it.
Okay, I know we've got a question back here.
Thank you. My name is Eric Lowe. I work for Booz Allen Hamilton as a strategic investor for various technologies related to space. My question is for the two entrepreneurs on the stage. As I don't know if you are raising venture capital or not, but is there any lessons learned that you can share with any aspiring entrepreneurs in the room as far as how you can explain the IP situation that you essentially lend or borrow from NASA, and how is that going to affect your company's operations going forward?
Sure. So in our case, the way I described to the company when I first talk to people is I say we're a NASA spin-out developing implants to treat rare diseases. And if it gets into a question, the way I'll describe it is we have an exclusive license from NASA for a certain set of diseases that we're able to work with the capsule. And we have this license, and as we develop this technology more, we'll develop derivative IP, which means you have the license for this one patent, but as you find more procedures to be able to really refine and sophisticate the process, you're then able to develop intellectual property around that as well. And so your intellectual property portfolio starts with this license, and then you're able to develop your own offshoots of that. And that's the way I describe it. There's more specifics, I'd be happy to get into it. That's the way I'll typically handle it.
I'd say for the building application, the buildings are a rather conservative field. So if you look at like plots of innovation construction, so it's flat, so maybe that'll change soon. But in order to convince people that this new technology was something we could actually put on a structure, saying that, explaining that it is a NASA technology and that NASA was involved in the testing and commissioning of it was one of the important parts of doing that first test. And if we hadn't actually gotten the thing on the building, then we wouldn't have gotten any investors. So the first part of, we're kind of lucky because we're a company that builds buildings, so we could do the first part self-funded. But after we could sell the item that's on the building, so we didn't need external funding to sell something to and serve a need. But the next round of funding was, so the value of the NASA technology was something that was other investors saw as important, and that's some of what helped Hummingbird take off.
I will add as well, just in terms of lessons learned, before we started this, I didn't, I guess, value enough the ability to get a license from NASA and the actual significance of that. I thought it'd just be kind of quick and easy process and be done with it. I've realized now there is actually a lot of value just to have completed that process. And so I would add as well into any entrepreneurs, and understand it will take some time, but is a very valuable asset once you have achieved that goal.
Any more questions? Well, okay, this will be, a question from here.
So I represent the camera here because there's people watching online as well. I don't know if they warned you about that, but there was a question online about, for Stephen, how many spin-offs are there? Like, how long has this been going on? Is it 100 companies, 1,000 companies? Do you have any statistics like that?
That's a great question. I don't know how many we have, but you will find spin-off magazines going back decades. So if you go if you Google spin-off, you will find all the technologies. But as I said, our current patent portfolio, and of course that gets refreshed. Patents will come off of what we have available, and then new ones will come on. But of it, only about 20% have been licensed. But over the years, the other thing is we have software companies that have used our technology that aren't part of the patent portfolio. So it's a great question. Don't know how many, but you can find so many of them out there on Spinoff magazine.
Okay, our last question, and then our guests will stay around. The bar will stay open, so the rest of it will be informal, but here's our last question.
Oh, good. Okay. So, sort of along those lines, Stephen, you talked about the Bigelow habitat, and I think just to give us an idea of the depth of that NASA technology, as I recall, the Bigelow habitat is a technology that was NASA put together in the 1960s, I believe. And the same with a vibration damper. I mean, NASA's been launching rockets since about the 1960s. So I imagine there had some sort of vibration damper, maybe not the same one, in the scaffold that launched the Mercury and Gemini capsules, let alone the Saturn V.
So actually, those two technologies are rather recent. It's true that we've been launching rockets since the 60s, but the rocket that Elizabeth had talked about was unique in that it was very thin. And because of that, it actually introduced a vibration with a different rocket design. And so that was actually done during the Constellation program. And that's when we had a unique design that required that solution in there. So that was actually done in the 2000s. The TransHab was actually a project in Houston that happened in the mid-1990s that we were looking to be able to look at a Mars habitat. So that actually is, once again, rather recent. And in the 2000 is when Bigelow came out. And the other thing that they challenged with is when you license our technology, in the image there, you'll notice, may have noticed that there were no windows in our habitat. There was no need to put a window in there. For Bob Bigelow, when he was trying to build a space hotel, he figured if he can't have a window for his customers to be able to look at the stars or down to Earth, he wouldn't get many paying customers. So he was challenged in trying to put a window into the habitat. How do you build a habitat with a window that doesn't pop out every time you try to inflate it? And so he actually ended up getting to another agreement with NASA to work together, and he put a facility outside our fence to be able to build a habitat with a window on it, and that's the one that's circling up there. So yes, we have technology that have been around for a long time, but you'll see in the current patent portfolio, those will be recent technology, because after a while, patents expire. If we don't get much traction on patents, we won't continue to renew the licenses, and we'll make sure that we make the best use of the investment that we get from the taxpayers to only keep those licenses that seem to have interest by the public.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you then. Please fill out some of these surveys. They're very helpful to us. And everyone, thank you.
Thank you.
No problem. Should I put the music back again?